Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Rad Friends podcast, where we look at life's thorniest questions with one of our rad friends. Today, I'm joined by Anita Amini, who is a software engineer and a somatic coach. And our question for today is, what is self-love? Hello, Anita.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to drop right into how this all came about. And I'll tell a story that I found Anita's profile on Twitter, and her pinned tweet was an essay that said, let me see, I have the title, How I Finally Found Self-Love, or What I Call Internal Love. And so as I read through this essay, which we'll talk about, I was just blown away. Every paragraph, I kept saying to myself, this is me. This is me. I tried this. I felt this. I feel this. I hurt this way. I've tried. So I just kept reading it, and I just started forwarding it to at least 40 different people. I'm like, this is us. This is us. She gets us. And so we're going to talk about this all. So I wanted to give that context. So Anita, why don't you tell us, we were just talking earlier, you're in a transitional phase, but you went to school for pharmaceutical studies,
Yeah.
and then you became a software engineer, and now you're a somatic coach. Walk us through a little bit. Paint that picture for us, please.
Sure. Yeah, so I did pharmaceutical science at uni because chemistry was one of my favorite subjects and it seemed like a fun degree. But about 6 months into it, I was like, oh, actually, this is not for me. I don't like working in a lab and I don't like pharmaceutical companies. So it was like, it didn't make sense to be in that degree. But I had made such amazing friends by that point that I was like, I'm just going to stay and hang out with my friends. So I finished that degree and worked in that field for a couple of years, but I kind of looked at the most senior person in the unit that I was working in, and I was like, if I don't want that job, then why am I, you know, why be
Wow.
here? And then I started looking at different options, and eventually I landed on coding, and I got really hooked on it. And yeah, I started training in it. I did a boot camp, and that's what I've been doing for work for the last six, I think, close to 7 years. But in 2021, I got really burnt out. I was working for an online pharmacy, and during COVID, we got really, really busy, and the workload was crazy, and I just got really burnt out. And yeah, I think we'll probably get into this later, but I had a lot of imposter syndrome. So the imposter syndrome was feeding the, you know, my desire to kind of throw myself into the work to kind of prove myself. And this was a vicious cycle that led to burnout. And eventually I had to leave because I just couldn't cope anymore. And I spent pretty much all of 2022 exploring stuff, healing, learning about what led me to burnout and how do I come out of it and how do I heal and how do I get to a place where there's a lot more ease in my system and there's less anxiety. And towards the end of that, I did this residency where I was with about 19 other participants. And everyone in that residency was doing different projects to do with attunement and somatic stuff and well-being. And for my project, I focused on IFS, which was something that I was becoming more and more interested in at the time.
And I'll
And so I
pause you there.
started, okay,
IFS is
sure.
a therapy modality, right?
Exactly, yeah. Internal family systems, which is it's a parts work modality related to the different parts of us that might have conflicting needs and desires. And I started doing that and kind of facilitating sessions there. And I also was facilitating a little bit of breath work. And then in earlier this year, 2023, I decided to try coding again. I was like, okay, I'm ready to work again. I'm ready to be engaging in those, I think, left brain activities, if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And so I kind of threw myself into that job, and then it was a freelance gig, so it was kind of more flexible, but I just knew that it wasn't working for me. And so eventually I was like, okay, I've been on this self-love journey, which we'll talk about later, but I have this thing, and then I have like IFS stuff that I did, which I really enjoyed. So why don't I kind of bring these two things together and start doing sessions again, and with more, and then this time with more of a self-love lens. And that's what I've been doing so far. It's been really fun.
I love this. And one of the great things about the guests on this podcast is that it's really hard to describe what they do. It's very hard for me to describe what I do. I'm like an author, an internet entrepreneur, a coach. I don't even a dad. I usually just go with I'm a dad. But oh, you touched on so you touched on burnout, burnout induced by imposter syndrome, which we're going to come back to.
Yeah.
You talked about IFS, which is parts work, and I'm going to ask you about that as well. It's kind of my understanding of it is it's kind of our psyche is these different parts, are basically these different parts and needs and how they interact. But we'll come back to that. But I want to know, what were you like as a student in like middle school?
I haven't been thinking about it in a long time, actually. I think I felt out of place because I like to hang out with adults, and I found other kids a bit like my interests, and their interests were like, I was really into documentaries, and I was like
Mhm.
researching stuff in my free time. And meanwhile, my friends were talking about boys and music bands, and I just wasn't really interested in those things. So yeah, I remember being alone a lot, in terms of, even though I was around other people, I felt alone because I felt like my interests didn't align too well with
Mhm.
the others. And I think I also, even though I did okay at school, I did struggle because it was really hard for me to study a topic if I wasn't interested in it. And yeah, it was quite challenging. And also I'm an immigrant, so coming into secondary school as an immigrant, that was really difficult as well. So yeah, all around, I would think it was quite a challenging
And
experience.
you immigrated from where?
From Iran when I was 10
Okay, to
to
in
London.
to London.
Yeah, England. Yeah,
And you've been in London, in England, since you were 10?
I have.
Like,
Yeah, yeah.
got it. Got it. And so that I wonder and so what was the culture kind of how did your parents approach kind of education and achievement, kind of, immigrant family, new country, you're 10, you're a formed human, what was the role of education kind of in your household as a growing up?
Mm. It was really big, I would say. Like in So I did my primary school in Iran, and then I did my secondary school in the UK. And primary schools in Iran are way more difficult than the ones in the UK or the US. So after school, my parents would always help me with my dad would be helping me with maths and science, and then my mom would be helping me with literature, and kind of, she's coming from an arts background, so she was helping me with like humanities and those kind of subjects. And so they were both helping me a lot on the side, because I think in Iran, the school itself is not enough. You need support on top of school itself, because otherwise you won't kind of get ahead from their eyes. So yeah, there was a lot of like, we gotta do extra work on the side. So there was that, and then there was obviously this expectation to become a doctor, which is quite familiar, I think, to many
Yes.
immigrants. So it was like,
Oh, so that transcends Asian culture. That transcends that crosses the pond.
yeah, which actually it's funny because I just went back recently, just a couple weeks ago, and I saw like that actually, if you are a doctor, you do really well. So I kind of saw for the first time where this obsession comes from, because I didn't understand it before, because like that it doesn't quite translate to the UK culture, because there's jobs where you could make way more money in the
Yeah.
UK than being a doctor. So
Sadly,
Uh,
being a doctor in London might be like a middle class job
yeah, it
compared to
is.
being a
Yeah,
banker.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like in New York. Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. And did you that feeling of the my peers don't understand, don't share my interest? I think you used the word belonging. Did that ever? When did that go away, or did that ever subside?
Mm. I think at uni I had that a bit less because I found just a really loving group of friends and we were really tight. And I think we had, even though we all had very different interests and different like life principles, we had enough in common that kind of brought us together. And like we
Oh,
just like to just sit around and laugh and make jokes. And it was just like a really fun group to be in. And I think I felt like I belonged more in that group, even though maybe some of our interests were quite different.
got it. Very
Yeah.
cool. And so let's go back to, I'm sure we'll circle back because I'm curious how a lot of the self love, self acceptance questions come back to being a child, being a, how we grew up, how we were raised. But so you said so you made this pivot to software engineering and you said, I'm paraphrasing, burnout, imposter syndrome induced burnout. Say, what is that? What happened?
Sure. Yeah, I think I was in a job that I really cared about. I think it was at the time, it was the job that I had liked the most compared to my previous roles. So I really cared and I really cared about the people. And I felt because it was an online pharmacy, I felt like what we were doing physically impacted people for the better. So especially during COVID. So there was all this like expectation on myself to really deliver and really have impact as much as possible. And then there was this other side that was like, oh, I have to produce the highest quality work. And this pressure, it was just too much. Eventually it just got too much. And I think that pressure also came from imposter syndrome. So it was like this voice of like, oh, you lack in these ways when it comes to your skill set. Therefore, you need to double down and do more and spend more time and perfect this. And it wasn't even perfection, actually. It was more like, I just need to spend more time.
Mm. Was,
And
sorry,
go ahead. Yeah.
was, was, did you feel that when you were in pharmacy school or like that, the
Uh,
role after
from
pharmaceutical?
no, because I felt what's the word? Underutilized in that
Okay.
role. So I didn't feel that at the time. And actually what I wanted was something to mentally challenge me and or intellectually challenge me.
Mm.
And I got that. So that
Yeah.
was great. Like that really satisfied that itch as encoding did. But then it came with this like this self-doubt that I had. It was like
Mm.
the perfect environment for that self-doubt to be fed and to grow and
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. Is that, and the, do you think it has to do with you not taking the traditional, like if you had majored in computer science, do you think you would have felt that same level? Is it because you took an atypical path into coding that you felt that?
Yeah, I think that had a big what's the word, like a big role in it. For sure, because I felt like I lacked some of the foundations and the, I don't know, legitimacy, I guess. And at the same time, I had so many interests on the side. So I wasn't willing to kind of do the work that was required to get that foundation in place. Like I did to the extent that I was able to do, but I wasn't willing to do it like every waking moment because I had so many other interests and things that I was doing in my free time. So it felt like there was always this race that I was losing. It was like, oh, I need more time to kind of
Mm.
learn these things and to improve. And I think there's also this pressure is just something that is common in the programming field.
Mm.
I don't think it's necessarily unique to me, but I think my brain or my body just took it to the next level. And
Yeah.
And I think at some point it got to a point where, because it was painful, I was avoiding it. And so it was like, yeah, it's just this cycle that wasn't fruitful.
We've talked a lot about burnout on this podcast with a few different guests, and one guest or two guests have actually said they've kind of looked at burnout in two ways. There's burnout that's imposed upon you from someone. So like in an investment banking would be a classic example, when it's like they give you the work at 10 p.m. So,
Mm,
you're going to burn out just by virtue of showing up, right?
yeah.
Someone imposed that burnout on you. But then there's a much more subtle burnout, which is self-induced burnout, which can come from so many different places. And like, I feel that all the time in the sense that I I feel like I always need to be doing something productive. And so even when I'm doing the dishes, I'm listening to a podcast. If I'm in my car, if my kids are just slightly distracted, I have like 3 books I can pick from, like easy, medium, hard. And so whatever I'm feeling in that moment, I could just like grab, medium, right? Like hard might be like the Bhagavad Gita, and easy might be, some biography about a rapper or something like that. And it's not always advancing my career per se, but it's just that need to just like always be active. And so I wanted to ask you, when you alluded to some of it, but how much of that burnout was externally imposed, like the high expectations of your colleagues or your boss or the culture you were working in?
I would say not a lot. There was a little bit of it because there had been redundancies in the company. So there was suddenly less people for the same amount of workload. And because, it was COVID, so there was a lot of demand on our business. But I would say the majority of it was self-imposed. It was coming
Hmm.
from, the stuff that I alluded to, like the imposter syndrome and the self-doubt. It was like, oh, I need to quiet this thing. Otherwise, I mean, there's like this existential thing of you think that even though rationally you know that you're not going to get fired because you're doing a good job, there is still this voice at the same time that says, I need to do better, I need to do better, I need to do better. So it was, I would say, majority of it was self-imposed.
Yeah. Oh God, that voice, that I need to do better. I need to do better voice. And so take us to what, at the depths, this led you to quit.
Yeah.
At the depths of your burnout, like what was happening to you physically and emotionally?
So I was feeling a mix of, on one level I was completely numb and just hopeless. Like the image that comes to mind is like I was on a train and this train was going, and I just knew that I need to jump off, but I couldn't because I was too scared to jump off. And I knew that I was burnt out, and I knew that when you burn out, coming back to your baseline is going to take way more time than if I just stop now. Like when I was, say, halfway through that process, like I knew, and my partner had been through burnout, so I kind of knew what that process looks like. And knowing that didn't help. Like I still couldn't come off that train, and I was so overwhelmed to the point that even if I needed to order something from Amazon, or just like I needed something to do around the house or something, I just couldn't. Like I was so overwhelmed by the smallest task. Even texting someone sometimes felt too overwhelming for me. And I just was, I could feel in real time my brain was rewiring, because suddenly fear became the dominant emotion, whereas before that wasn't the case. And I could see that things that didn't scare me before, like the idea of even asking for annual leave, which I always did freely, even that started to become scary. And
Mm.
yeah, everything felt like it came with more pressure, like more risk, or like there was more risk to every action. And yeah, my brain was just in this high alert, high threat
Mm.
kind of situation. And actually I decided to leave, and then my managers asked me to go on sick leave instead, just to take a break. So I went on sick leave, and then I went on holiday with my family, and I actually had a panic attack during that trip. And that was one of the moments where I realized, okay, like this is actually gotten out of hand. I need to, because I hadn't had that experience before. And
First,
where I,
your first panic attack.
yeah. And that's when, when I was on that holiday, I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'll go back to work then. Like I've had some time off. But when I had that panic attack, I was like, oh no, this is like way more fundamental than I realized I'm going to take as long as I need.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few times, there was a train, you were scared of getting off the train. There was a fear of the train. And you said, everything, there was a fear of asking for leave. Was there a specific set of fears that you could like name? Or was it like, what were those fears, if it's possible to name?
I think there was this fear of going into the abyss, in that if I was just saying to myself, okay, I'm going to leave this job and I'm going to give myself 2 months and then I'm going to start looking for another job. If that was the plan, I would have been fine. But I knew that I wasn't capable of that in that moment. I knew that I needed way more time. Like deep down, I knew that I needed at least 6 months or more. So that felt like being untethered from my support system, which was having a job that paid.
Hmm.
And I'd never been off of that lifeline. So that's what was scary for me. It was like the unknown of, and also there was a part of me that was like, oh, maybe this coding thing is not for you because it's getting too harmful and painful. And so I was like, but then what is, all I could see was just emptiness, just this void. Like you remove the coding skill, which is the thing that is the only way I know how to make a living. You remove that, and then there's just this void. And I just couldn't face, like, that just felt too scary. So I was like, well, if I stay on this path, then I know at least that I can keep making a living. And yeah, it was
And
just,
how much of
sorry. I was scared that if
go
I
on.
leave, I wouldn't be able to, like, get back on the train.
How much of it was financial? Like, I don't know how I can survive, my daily existence without a job.
It was financial in the sense that it was a scarcity mindset. So it was very much financial in terms of like the fear was like not being able to, because I think what I realized on that journey as well is that when I left my job and was able to like reflect on things, I realized that I used money and making a living as a way to be independent and not have to rely on other people, and not to have to ask for help, because if I have money then I can just use the money instead of ask for help. And that's what was scary. It's like if I lose that, then I'm on my own.
Got it. Interesting. Because oftentimes with scarcity, people, and I do this, their brains will catastrophize, which is like, if I leave this coding job, I can never get a coding job ever again. And I'll be broke and homeless and without healthcare. I mean, you guys have healthcare in England, but we don't. We have to pay for it. So it's almost more this kind of bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy, kind of like true. It's not rational, but it's a basic needs. It's a survival fear. It sounds like, and I'm putting words in your mouth, that the fear was more the help that comes from being able to use money to get access to help. Is that
It was
it?
both.
It didn't seem like you were
I did have
okay.
both. So I did have the one that's like, oh, if I leave this job, I will never, even though I had had so many coding jobs by that point. So I had proved to myself that like I'm capable of getting a coding job. But it felt like, oh, this time it will be different. And so I did have this fear of like, what if I never get a job like this ever again? And that I will lose money, and then what's going to happen? I will have to go back to my parents' house. What if my parents have problems, and then none of us, like, like I was going down that like it's not a rabbit hole. It's more like, I don't know, some form
Death
of
spiral.
spiral. Yeah. But I also had the thing that was to do with independence and not wanting to ask for help.
Totally. Yeah. It's one of our questions in the podcast. It's going to come out in a few weeks. Episode 6, I think, is why do we fear being ordinary? And so it's kind of talks about like that vacuum, that, an identity vacuum. Like, I'm a coder. I felt it leaving Wall Street. People ask, what do you do? It was like, I'm a dad. And we can, so many stories can infiltrate these identity vacuums. But so I want to come back. I want to pivot us into the self-love, because I feel like it sets the stage, at least. So you're kind of at this physical and emotional rock bottom or low, and you decide to quit. And so today's question, and for our listeners, we have these group coaching sessions where we talk about these questions. So check out radreads.co/coaching. So today's question is, what is self-love? And maybe, so you're at this bottom point, like what role is self-love starting to play here?
So the plants of this self-love quest, let's say, the seed of this was planted a couple years back. So so I was always interested in like personal transformation and healing and all this kind of work. And in one of those experiences, I realized that I had this kind of altered state of consciousness experience where I was like sitting on the sofa, and then I kind of saw, it's like I was sitting on the sofa, and then I could see myself standing and looking at me that was sitting on the sofa. And then the one that was standing looking at me didn't like me. And so that was the moment where I realized that I had parts in me that didn't like me or didn't love me. And that was a massive realization, because I just wasn't privy to that. I didn't have no idea that I had that in me, that, there was something that is inside me. So that really like got me curious about self-love. And then what happened was that every time I was
that, can I interrupt you there? Was that a psychedelic
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
experience, or that you were just,
No, it was
okay.
it was a psychedelic experience. Yeah.
I've had similar as
Did
well.
you? Okay. I would love to
Yeah.
hear.
Well, I'll talk once you, it will come up
Okay.
later.
Okay.
But
Cool.
do you think though, because I think I've talked about psychedelics a bunch on this podcast. I've only had one psychedelic journey. I think a lot of listeners are like, I refuse to do psychedelics. And so I think they're gonna dismiss what we're gonna say. Not dismiss, but they're gonna view it as completely unrelatable.
Okay.
Because they won't walk through that door. And I'm not a pro or against it. It's something I did that was very impactful. But how would you respond to that? Where it's like, oh, I can't relate because I'm never going to do psychedelics.
I think
So I might never see that.
I've had glimpses of those kind of experiences in other settings. So I think that psychedelics is like one of the most obvious ways to bring about those experiences, but I've had them in many different experiences where I've been exposed to heat, where I've had that experience, or I've had it in, in breathwork journeys, or I even had quite an important experience in a cacao ceremony. Like that was not like, cacao is not very, it's not a strong substance or anything. So I think that those things, if we're sensitive enough to it, they can come about in meditation, etc. So that's what I would say in response to that. I think it's not unique to psychedelics.
Mm-hmm. And so you see this version of you, this other, it's like can you, like, how old are you? Where are you?
I think it was like the same age as me. It didn't seem that distinct from me, but it was like I could see myself sitting on the sofa in a way that I don't normally obviously experience, And it's funny in that the same day during that same trip, I suddenly had this realization, and then I was like kind of like went inside and I could receive the confirmation that, yeah, that was the case. So I was like really sad and I was crying, etc. But then later on, I went to the kitchen to get a snack. So this is kind of towards the end of my trip, and I saw that I had the past version of me had left me a sandwich, and I just sat down on the kitchen floor sobbing because I was like, okay, like something in me does love me still, because it was like
Mm.
anticipating that I would need this food right now because I was not
Oh.
in a state to be preparing food. So that was a
And was this version of you talking to you? Like, was it say, or was it a felt
it was a felt
sense?
sense. Yeah. 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 And then, so that kind of just started this whole self love journey for me. And then every time I was having, either if I was having problems like self doubt or other issues that I was faced with, or if I was going into some kind of like healing journey, whether it was psychedelics or otherwise, my intention always was that I would always come to the same conclusion that, oh, if I loved myself more and if I had this like baseline of self love, then these problems would be very different, or they would feel very different. And at the time, I had a strong conviction that that would be the case, but I wasn't sure. And now being on the other side of that journey, I can kind of, it's confirmed for me that yeah, that is true. That the my baseline now feels very different, having gone through that
Yeah.
3-year journey of cultivating self love.
Wow. So you have this encounter with, and Anita 2.0 or whatever, I guess 1.0. And then you kind of, so you go back kind of to your everyday life, you're coding, you have you're experiencing the burnout, the imposter syndrome. What else are you, but I can relate to this and I'll share my part
Right.
after we go through your part, but you can relate, but the way I explain psychedelics is you can't unsee the thing that you
Yeah.
saw. And people are like, oh, you're high. It's not like you're drunk or on, Molly or all that. It's like, it's crystal. It's almost like you're dead sober.
Yeah.
And, and it just, you see it. And I just, like, I mean, I have goosebumps now. It's just like, you can't unsee it. And I think that scares people. I think it's also very beautiful. So you see this thing that presumably, I hate to put words in people's
That's
mouths, but that you presumably can't
yeah.
unsee. And so but you kind of get back to your life that is kind of stressful. What else is unfurling for you in that self-love journey?
So then I'm noticing, as I'm living life and as I'm kind of doing the coding work, etc., I'm realizing how this like lack of self-love manifests on a day-to-day basis. So I'm realizing that if something happens at work, suddenly I spiral and get so much self-doubt where I'm just like undermining all of my achievements and just focusing on that one thing that went wrong. Or if I'm in a social interaction with someone and something happens, I feel really self-conscious afterwards. Or yeah, all of these kind of things I'm realizing, oh, this is related to the self-love. And so I started like gravitating more towards things that I was already doing, but I was like doing it more with this intention of like, okay, I'm gonna focus on this self-love thing. And one of the things I did was Joe Hudson's masterclass, The
Mhm.
Art of Accomplishment. So I did that, and that a lot of what I focused on during that is a 8 week course. It was quite intense, and a lot of what I focused on was the self doubt, and actually that course basically kind of got rid of my internal negative monologue, like a
Yeah.
negative inner voice, which I felt was like huge in terms of like the before and after was quite big.
Hmm.
And yeah, I went through lots of different experiences like this.
Oh,
And yet
I'll
yes,
pause you on the Joe
sure.
Hudson course. So I had the privilege of meeting Joe. Joe's a very hard person to describe. He's this spiritual seeker, but he's a VC. He's also a VC, a philanthropist. He's hilarious. He has this way. I just met him for a weekend, and he has this way of just he like looks at you and he just kind of sees what you're thinking. Just it was mind blowing. I feel very, Joe, if you're listening to this, I feel very honored to have been in your presence. But I'm going to read. So here this is the one sentence that really drew me to really dig into your story, which led us to here. And I'm just going to read it. I have my phone. He said, so I took this course. It's an online course that anyone can take. I haven't taken it yet, but it's on my list. Much of what Joe taught us rested on the premise that almost all of us grow up with a false notion that we are not inherently, quote unquote, good. This problematic belief then prevents us from loving ourselves because, well, why would we be worthy of love if we're bad? And so I just want to pause that as like, most of us grow up with the false notion that we are not inherently good. Say more about that.
Yeah, I mean this premise it comes from Joe Hudson, so I can't take any credit for this, but it really resonated with me because it kind of, I think when I heard that and when I experienced it in the course, it clicked onto this realization I had prior to this when I realized I didn't like myself, because I was like, oh, that's kind of, I got a glimpse into that like on a vivid level. I don't know, it was quite vivid for me, right? And actually it's funny when, and maybe I'm jumping over some details here, but the kind of this 3-year journey, the way it ended in some, maybe ended is the wrong word because I feel like it's a lifelong journey, but in a way that it got to some conclusion, let's say, with regards to what my goal was with regards to the journey. So what happened was, like, again, I was in another psychedelic experience, and then this time, after coming out of all these journeys of trying to love myself and trying different techniques, I discovered something deep. It just felt like the deepest parts of me, and it wasn't even a part, it was just like something. And it was like this thing did not give a damn about what I did or what I do. It just loved me no matter what. And that was kind of going back to this belief that we're not inherently good. It was like this part was kind of telling me that I don't actually care about what you do. You're good anyways. And there was almost this moment of like, oh, I don't even need to have shame about my actions, because, not to say that I don't need to take responsibility for my actions, but I don't need to be personally ashamed because I'm good regardless.
Yeah. Oh, that's like so moving, and it's so beautiful. And I know that so many listeners will, it's almost, I've gotten a glimpse of that, but it almost feels unfathomable to get to that state, like unimaginable for folks that are kind of wired like you and I are wired, we're wired. But I'll give you, we'll circle back. So I'll share with you similar. So for me, it's been less imposter syndrome and more just needing to prove to others that I am X. I'm talented, I'm smart, I'm special, I'm wealthy, like just like pick whatever marker, be it explicit or implicit. So like people always show like, okay, has a new hobby. And then, 2 years later, he's going to be so good at it because he becomes obsessive about it. And what it's true, it's like, oh, like I decided to like learn how to surf, and like I'm a really good surfer now 4 years later. But what they don't see is how much pressure I put on myself. And I'm like I'm thinking about, I'm studying, I'm like, and I will never be a professional. I will never be anything in anything to anyone in surfing, because I started when I was 38 years old. But there is this, like when people say like, wow, you're a really good surfer, it just like, it makes me momentary. It's like a drug. It's like
Mm.
a sip of alcohol. And so one of my coaches, you might have crossed paths with him, Andrew Taggart. He's a practical philosopher, but we joked during our coaching sessions that they were called micro orgasms. So my whole life was in pursuit of micro orgasms, just these little hits of like, you're good, you're cool, you're smart. Basically, they're
Yeah.
validation hits. And when I couldn't get the validation hit, then I would turn to alcohol or, food or whatever, or exercise. But it was just like, I was addicted to getting those hits of validation. And I knew something was off. That led to I never personally had like I'm burnt out, or maybe I did in the sense like I left Wall Street, but it's almost like burnout wasn't, first off, I'm, a, I'm older than the burnout, I like I like I'm from like now I'm sounding like an old fucking man, but yeah, I'm from the generation where burnout was like a badge of honor, right? And so people would brag about taking red eyes. They would brag about how little they slept. Like that was in the culture. No one cared about sleep, professional industries. So to some extent, burnout, I didn't even have the language for it because it wasn't part of the zeitgeist. And then, and then I reached a point, it's like, oh, even if I did, I probably would have found a way to self-justify it to myself. Oh, you're not burned out. You just need to try harder. You just need to do this. So will give you a frame of like, for example, when I worked on Wall Street, I didn't let myself read fiction. And I love fiction.
Wow.
I was like, why would I? It's probably a little bit like your coding. You're like, you could always be improving. Like, why would I waste time reading fiction when I can read a textbook about stochastic calculus and be like way better at finance and make more money and get all these accolades? And I think more than the money, people would be like, can you believe he read like the textbook on stochastic calculus when everyone else is like watching MTV Real World or something? And it brought me a sense of self. It made me proud. It brought me validation, but it was also like alcohol. It was so fleeting, and you needed more and more and more of it to maintain your base level of feeling. I would say self-worth, but very much self-love. I think they're almost interchangeable. And so so I personally went through a lot of what I would call talk therapy. It was mostly like different modalities of coaching, but I just talked my way through it for the past 10 years, hours a week, all different spiritual, technical, businessy, conscious businessy, leadership, just from every angle we talked about this. And it kind of, I'm like, oh, okay, now I start to see these patterns. But I was with our mutual friend, Johnny, and he said something like, at some point, at some level, you reach a point where talking no longer serves you. Like I could keep talking about this. I fucking started a podcast to talk about it. I could talk about this till I'm blue in the face, but it's not changing that core wound. Right. And so that's when a lot of my peers said, look into somatic, and we'll talk about somatic because I didn't even know what that word meant until 4 months ago. But I'll bring this back to the psychedelic journey, which is the only one I've had kind of organized with a therapist, to guru, however you want to facilitator, professional facilitator. And so in this journey, I'm laying down. It was a joint one with my wife. So I'm laying in bed, and there's two therapists, like one for her and one for me. And I have an eye mask on. It's the middle of the day on a Friday. Our kids are being watched by my in-laws. Like we flew out our kids to do this. And I'm getting all these over the course. People will hear the whole journey, but this one specific part. So I'm just laying there and I'm just kind of chilling. By the way, in my journey, I met this other version of myself.
Oh, wow.
So kind of like you. So I met another version of myself. But this version it's almost like a pure, like not subject to envy, not caring about what other people think. Just kind of like, imagine if you could just like completely be free. Free, I guess, is the right. So there was free K and there was normal K. And the two of us were just having a conversation. He's like, why do you get so upset when this happens? And I would answer. So it was just this conversation in my head. I wasn't even speaking it. So free, pure K, and then everyday K. And then at one point, I just start, I'm laying down and I just start repeating to myself over and over and over again. I just want to be a good boy. I just want to be a good boy. I just want to be a good boy. And it was like, my heart was racing. It wasn't scary. It was just very intense. And this was actually physically intense. I was like sweating and my heart was racing. And I wasn't even, in my mind, I was actually saying, I want to be a good boy. I want to be a good boy, but I actually wasn't. I asked that they're like, was I talking? They're like, no, you weren't saying a thing. And so I'm just saying, I just want to be a good boy. And then pure K turns to this other, everyday K and says, K, you don't have to be good. You are good. And just like this, like, I was just overwhelmed by like emotions. Like, so it's a little bit like the sand. I don't know what part is like this, like someone left you the sandwich, but I was just so just floored by that because the next thought that came from normal K was, what if every action I've ever taken in my life was to prove to others that I was good? And what would it look like if I no longer had to do that? Like that, all in that moment, I'm going to have like insane goosebumps from all this, but and it started to fade a little bit, but now, when, I don't know what, today we had a coaching call and we sent the wrong dial-in. We fucked up the dial-ins. And so one person was a little bit upset because it's pretty expensive and it's unclear whose fault it was. Immediately, I'm like, "Okay, you're a bad person. Like you're trying to rip off this person. You're not, this person's going to go off to their corner and think about how bad, how dishonest you were and how you tried to steal their money or cut corners or what that." And so now I can come back and I know what's at play. I know that it is this threat to my goodness. And I can kind of say to myself, like, it was just a mistake. You are still you are a good person. And you just move on, and before it would have been this spiral of like, you suck, you're this, you that, you're this, and this is so I stopped there because that was like that when I think I read your essay probably like 2 weeks after that happened. So it kind of all came together so quickly. So that's my story on goodness.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. There's a lot of like common themes across both of our stories. It makes sense that we're having this conversation, I guess, because there's so much overlap. And it sounds like, in a way, because of that experience and because of that realization and meeting pure K, it sounds like your baseline changed in a way, right? Like now you don't spiral the same way maybe as before. And
it's absolutely true. My baseline did change, and it's almost like, imagine, you have like a camera that can only see like a horse with the blinders. So it's like I only knew the world through this one very narrow perspective, was like fighting to always prove that I'm good. And now it's like they're opened up and it's like I can still see that lane that I used to live in, but it just has such a richer context. And what I haven't had though, is when you said this, this other time you just had this like, this flood where you were just like I feel like I've gotten a taste of it, but I don't fully live and breathe and feel it yet, which is fine. I think it's like anything. These are lifelong journeys to see, but like at least and this is why I love kind of what I do is just, if you could just open the door a little bit for someone else, just the fact that the door can be open changes the way that they can see it. So yeah, I'm back on my self-love journey. So that's, or it continues.
Amazing. Yeah, it's just like you said, it takes that one shift in perspective to then send you off on this kind of journey and to start to see the situations as being, it's like, yeah, you can just step back from it and have perspective and not get sucked into it the same way. And I love that all it takes is just one little perspective shift or
Mm.
one little vision,
Yeah.
because yeah, it's very transformational. And I think for me, like maybe 3 years ago, if I had heard this conversation and the stuff that we're saying, I would have think that it's completely unreachable and just unfathomable.
Mhm.
But yeah, I just want to say that it's like way more reachable than, like, if someone is listening and they're like, oh, whatever, like I can't quite get what
Yeah.
this is about. And I think, yeah, I would say it's way more accessible and reachable. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're listening, if you're the child of immigrants, or if you're immigrants that thought you should be a doctor, a banker, a lawyer, and even if, psychedelics are not on your menu of things you want to do, like, it is absolutely, absolutely possible. I never in a million years thought that I would be, A, these words would come out of my mouth, and B, they would come out of my mouth in such a public forum that, I'd be proud of it, and I'd want others to know, because culturally, and I suspect it's similar with you, it's like, I think my parents probably listen to this podcast and they're probably like, what is, like, he's got, like, first he quit his Wall Street job. Now it's like psychedelics with his wife. Like, what the fuck is wrong with this kid?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that, like, I think our, I don't know if achievements is the right word, but these kind of
Mhm.
discoveries are
Just,
illegible to our parents, and I think that creates a little bit of a disconnect. But I think ultimately, I think most parents want their children to be happy, and this is kind of heading more towards happiness
yeah,
than anything else. So
a- absolutely. Can you tell me, so going back to Joe's workshop, so that was where he said most people suffer from this belief that they're not inherently good. Like, what happened? There's a room of what, 20, 50 people on, this is all on
yeah.
Zoom. Like, what happened? Like, what happened to you after kind of that statement was made?
Yeah, I think something definitely clicked for me, because I was like, I'm always looking for like principles and kind of mental models and things that will kind of put things into perspective or make things make sense. And this was one of those moments where I was like, oh, this suddenly everything just fell into place when I heard that. But then hearing it was one thing, and then actually like doing the work to practice it, to actually internalize it and make it be part of the body and the system. That was like a whole other thing, because they put you into smaller groups of like 5-6 people, and then they also put you in a partnered, like group of 2 people. So for 8 weeks you're meeting with these people and going through these exercises. So like an exercise would be like, I'm trying to remember, I think I gave an example in the post.
Yeah, it's, if I didn't have to improve or something, I'd rather improve my ex than love myself as I am.
Yeah,
And yet to repeat.
and then you're just encouraged. So you will have a partner, like we are now, for example. Like we would set a timer for 7 minutes, and then I would be keep saying I would I would keep saying that with a different prompt each time, or with a different value for X each time. And then as you do
For,
that, you get closer and closer to the truth. And then there's
wow.
this like realization, and then you're like, oh, okay, so I do these things in order to improve, because ultimately I want to be loved, but I think that in order to be loved, I need to improve. And like that just
Mm,
sinks in, and you're being witnessed while you're going through that. and then you go on to the next exercise, and then you're doing this for 8 weeks. So you're
Wow.
bound to come out as a different person by the end of it.
So I would just say to you for 4 minutes, I'd rather improve my surfing than to love myself how I am. I'd rather lift more weights than to love myself how I am. I'd rather make more money as an entrepreneur than to love myself how I am.
Yeah.
Is that,
Yeah.
that
With
basically
more pauses, I would say, but yeah. So that it
with more
lands.
poses?
Yeah.
So you have to actually feel it in your
Yeah, and
body,
you
right?
wait for it to emerge from your body rather than your thinking brain. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
got it.
So
Got
one
it.
of the first exercises they gave us, which I think helped, it was one of the things that helped me to become more embodied, which was we had to introduce ourselves to the group, like the smaller group, from our head, and then from our heart, and then from our gut. And when we did that, I was amazed because I introduced myself from the head, and it's like what I've heard
Mhm.
before. It's like, oh, I do this for work, etc. And then I spoke from the heart, and I was like, whoa, who's talking? Like, where did this come from? And then I spoke from the gut, and then again, something else came. It was like, I like to walk on the grass barefoot. And I was like, since when? It was
Wow, that was the gut.
that was the gut, yeah.
Do you remember the heart?
I don't know, because it was 3 years ago.
Yeah, that that's fascinating. And so, how do you to our listeners? You said you turbocharge this, and you mentioned breath work, you mentioned internal family systems, you mentioned Tara Brach and Rain. I've seen you allude to Kristen Neff's work. If you had to distill down kind of the noob's guide to self-love, like a little mini journey or curriculum, what would that what are some of the what are some of the core things that modalities that consists
Mm.
of, and what are actual ways that people could go and try them on their own or hire people?
Yeah. So, yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I've been kind of thinking about this question of like, okay, how do I take my journey and help someone get there in less time? And so I kind of came up with this framework or this pyramid where I broke down kind of everything I did fell into these 3 categories. And one at the base of the pyramid is, I call it safety in the body or nervous system
Mm.
regulation, which is basically
Okay.
this feeling of your nervous system is in a place that is able to perceive the environment as safe, and therefore being in your body feels safe. Because when we're in a frozen state or in a fight or flight state, the body wants to escape, or sorry, the mind wants to escape from the body, because the body is too much feelings of discomfort in the body. And when we're able to regulate the nervous system, and that's what I was doing with the breath work, I was doing down-regulated breathing exercises every day. This was because basically the burnout put me into a combination of frozen and fight or flight state. And that became my new normal, my new baseline. So I had to, with the breathing exercise, I had to bring it back to now bring my baseline to the parasympathetic, to safety essentially.
God.
And I think,
So is
yeah.
that fair? I just got a surprise tax bill, and it's way higher than the amount of cash that I have in the business bank account. And so all of a sudden my mind starts racing. I'm a very heady, and I imagine our listeners are very heady people. So my mind's racing, could I do this? Could I do that? I can't believe, there's self-doubt. I can't believe you didn't do this. Can't believe you do that. Should you do this? Should you do that? Obviously, my body, there's a ton of shit happening in my body in that moment. What is it? Is that first level basically connecting all the mental spiral parts that's happening in your brain to basically ground you back into that moment? Or is that
It's
how would
the
you?
kind of being able to jump from that state to a parasympathetic state, kind of as quickly as possible. Well, it doesn't have to be super quick, but being able to actually get into that state and then ground yourself, so that then, because what happens is when you're in a fight or flight, for example, your brain is just picking up, like seeing everything as a threat, or like really
Mm.
trying to notice like all the threat signals. And even when it comes to like communicating with someone, you might interpret like their facial patterns as being like again threatening. So when you get grounded, then you can kind of in a way see reality for what it is, as opposed to like your own projection of lack of safety. So yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, the grounding, being able to ground. And I realize as well, like when you ground, your capacity grows. So there's been times where I've been at a party, for example, and I'm like, oh, I'm so overwhelmed. I just want to go home. And then I think about the journey. I'm like, oh shit, it's going to take me an hour to get home. What am I going to do? Like, I don't have the capacity to even deal with the next hour because I'm so overstimulated. And then like, I'll go to the toilet or to a room or somewhere and I'll do some breathing exercises. And then I'll be like, actually, I think I can socialize for another hour. So your
Got
capacity changes based on where your nervous system is at. Yeah.
it. And in your post, there was an app that you had mentioned that teaches these different
Yeah, I use
kinds of breathing.
Othership. Yeah.
Othership. Cool. So is that a good place? I mean, I know some basic breathing. I think you might know Connie
Mhm. Yeah.
Bialski. I might butcher her last name, but I worked with her for breath work back in
Cool.
the day. So I have some tools on breath work, but I'm a little dusty, and I definitely need the down regulation breath work. So okay, so that's the bottom. That's the first pyramid of DIY self-love.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah,
what
the
would
next
the
one
second?
is feeling your emotions. So this was something that I had this kind of advice being thrown around a lot before. And I was like, sometimes I say I would be in a bad situation. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to feel my emotions. And then I would sit there and then immediately my brain would distract itself. And then I would realize, and then I would come back and I'd be like, okay, I'm going to feel my emotions. And then and then this cycle would just repeat. Or I would grab my phone and then I would put my phone far away and sit back again. And I just couldn't do it. And then what happened was after leaving my job, I'd been doing the breathing exercises every day. So I'd been working on my nervous system, and then I'd also started IFS therapy. And about 6 months into this process, one day I was talking to my partner, and then suddenly I realized, so I hadn't gone to therapy for the last like couple of weeks, and I suddenly realized, oh my God, I've been regulating my own emotions without my therapist's help or my partner's help. And that was huge. And then I realized, and then I started doing it consciously, and I could do it suddenly, whereas before I couldn't. And I think the reason I couldn't before is a combination of the safety in the body thing that I mentioned, the nervous system regulation. And the other thing was the IFS therapy helped me essentially feel a lot of this unfelt emotions. Like I had this backlog from childhood, from all the years that I had lived. It's like I had this emotional debt that I needed to pay off before I could deal with the emotions in the present moment. So when I did that, then I was able to in the moment be able to feel my emotions, and that for me was like the most transformational skill, because yeah, I could essentially ride. It's a bit, I guess surfing is a good example. It's like riding a wave, and you ride this emotion, let's say there's sadness, and you ride it for a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds, and then the wave breaks. And then you have another emotion, maybe you have confusion, and then you ride it, and then it breaks. And then you ride the next one,
Yeah.
and eventually you get to just a feeling of calm and peace.
It's so beautiful to hear you describe that. As I'm hearing you talk, I'm realizing that I'm like you 3 years ago, where I think I intellectually get what you're saying, but I don't think I actually have ever experienced it. And as you were talking, I was like, I don't even know what emotions I've had. And, like it's almost like I've put emotions in this own it's like in a box, right? And I think especially emotions that would be perceived as, negative emotions like anger or frustration. And I'm just like, I think what happens is when those come up, there's a little voice that says, stop feeling that, don't feel that, don't feel that, not good for you to feel that. And then I distract myself somehow, like, with my phone or with like thinking about something else, like forcing myself. So it's crazy because it's a, yeah, I hear you. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think I know how to feel. Like that's kind of that's what I'm hearing as you're talking. And if I'm feeling that, I know many of our listeners are like, thank you for, like you're saying what I don't know. Do you ever get that? I'm sure you deal with like cerebral, heady people. It feels like a very cerebral thing to be like, I don't know what the fuck I'm feeling
Yeah.
ever.
And I understand that, and I think I used to be more like that, and I think even now sometimes there are times when I am resisting feeling something, so I'll catch myself scrolling on TikTok, or like I can catch myself like, oh, I'm avoiding something, and then something's like I'm
Yeah.
not ready to face it, so then I'm like, okay, fine, we'll just
Yeah.
scroll a little bit more, and I think if when we're used to resisting the emotions, that just becomes the pattern, it becomes the norm. But I would say it's not that out of reach, going from a place
Mhm.
of not being able to fully feel to a place of
Yeah.
being able to feel them.
And I would say I was mindlessly eating pistachios. They were like salted pistachios. And I was like, I'm not hungry. These aren't, they're satisfying, but when you've eaten 100
Yeah.
pistachios, the 101st is not that the 101st anything is not that satisfying, but I just can't stop. And it was like being on TikTok.
Yeah.
I can't stop. And I actually asked myself, I heard Johnny Miller, our friend, I heard his voice being like, hey, what are you feeling right now? And I guess, I went into breath.
Mm.
I was like, I took like a few deep breaths, but I still jumped to the intellectual. It's like, I'm nervous about this interview. I'm nervous about X. I'm nervous about Y. And so I'm excited to
Yeah.
explore the gap between the two.
Yeah, and I think there's a way to see that story without. So if we go back to the surfing analogy, is like you're riding the wave, and let's say there's like this sadness that's coming up, and I think sometimes you can get yanked from riding this wave. Like you can get yanked
Mm.
to be able to like engage with the story, but that keeps the emotion. And I think there's a way to look up and see the story while you're writing it without getting yanked. But I think it takes
Mhm.
some practice to kind of, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And so tell us about the third level of the DI, the self love. I'm
I
calling it
love it. I love
DIY,
it.
not your
I might
a
still.
hierarchy. Please do.
Yeah. So the next one is I. So you can call it connection or loving others, and this one is about essentially how we relate to other people, and how especially when we show up to a connection with mutually kind of grounded nervous systems, there can be a lot of room for just nourishing encouragement and loving attention that is not, you're not trying to get something out of them. You're just there because you like them and you appreciate them and stuff. And being in those kind of connections, you can essentially, by loving them, you teach yourself that you're able to love someone despite their weaknesses, which then teaches yourself that you can love yourself despite your own weaknesses.
Ooh.
And when they love you despite your weaknesses, you also get to experience that it's possible, that you are lovable despite your weaknesses. So those are the three layers.
Yeah. I mean, that like a classic one on that is just is family,
Mhm.
right? It's like family dynamics. It's like everyone loves each other, like that is clear. But the number of like attacks and microaggressions and passive aggressive and you're not doing this right. And like childhood traumas and all of that is, yeah, it reminds me, I'm sure you've done or know of loving
Hmm.
kindness meditation.
Meta.
And so the one time metta meditation, and the way I was taught it is you say you bring someone into your heart or into your heart space. You're like, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy, may you live with ease and in peace. I'm sure there's a lot of different variations. I remember once that I was super jet lagged, like one of those like 12-hour jet lags where you have like no concept of what time it is. And I just couldn't sleep. And I think I did a 1 hour meta meditation where I was just repeating that to all these like strangers and politicians and actors. And, it's just, you run out of people to direct it towards and that, and I think by the end I was like straight up hallucinating.
Wow.
It was just because it was so long. Normally when I do a like it's really like 5 minutes or 10 would be very long. But this time it was like 60 minutes. And I just remember just being overwhelmed by kind of an out of body experience and probably the jet lag as well. But I definitely, the journey that we came back from was a couples guided intense, like couples therapy, basically. And it wasn't really the journey part was the last part of it. And it was optional. So it wasn't really about that. That was more like, if you feel like doing it, you can do this thing as well. But the first couple of days were all about managing kind of like when two people fight in a marriage, how can you kind of regulate yourself emotionally and then communicate versus communicating in these like fight or flight modes, which as we learned for me is like anytime my wife gets mad at me, it's like, oh, I'm not a
Yeah.
good person, right? That's what I
Yeah.
hear when I know she doesn't think that. And so it's fascinating to just see the interplay amongst all those different levels. And someone who's somewhat of a tourist to the world of self-love I've experienced little bits and pieces of it throughout my own personal life.
Seems like you're more of a tourist now. You're local. Sounds like you're local.
I'm a local. Yes. Especially after this conversation. So yeah, so I'd love to wrap on, what would you tell someone who's listened to this and they're like, I feel everything that you've described. I get imposter syndrome at my work. My negative chatter is crazy. I feel disconnected from my body. I have this fundamental belief that I'm not inherently good. What are your parting thoughts to that person?
I would say focus on grounding. I think the nervous system stuff is probably the most important thing. And just acknowledge that, just kind of see your humanity and see that you're having a very human experience. And yeah, and if you're feeling ungrounded, yeah, just kind of focusing on being grounded so that eventually the body can become a safe haven.
Hmm. Beautiful. And I think I love how you said you're having a very human experience, which is what, we're two strangers on the internet meeting for the first time. I didn't want to say this at the beginning, but if you've listened this far, this was just meant to be a get to know each other conversation. And Anita was gracious enough. I was like, I think people would benefit from this. And we're basically going to talk about the same thing. So I thank you, Anita, for allowing our listeners into what was meant to be a private space, but really just like a beautiful reminder of this shared human experience, right? I think that's what attracted me to your story. And that's what attracts people to listen to this podcast is that people will be experiencing these things and to know that they're not unique in that suffering and that self-doubt. It's like a very common thing, and we're all supporting each other, and we all have experienced it. So I'm super grateful. And thank you for allowing us to record what was meant to be a private get to know you phone call, and pulling out your microphone and changing headphones throughout the interview.
Yeah, thank you for deciding to hit record on this and suggesting that, because I love listening to conversations on podcasts, and I'm always like, oh my God, I'm so glad they recorded this. Imagine this could have been a private phone call. And so, yeah, I
Yes.
really appreciate that. And I think, again, I would echo what I said earlier about all the stuff we discussed. Is like, if some of it feels out of reach, I would say, yeah, it's definitely reachable and doable, and yeah, all the best.
Yes. And so before we sign off, I always ask our guests, is there any creator, writer, thinker, artist that you think needs more people need to know about? And so I don't know if anyone comes to mind for you.
Yeah, the person that comes to mind is my good friend Nebras. I think her handle is Hey Nebras on Twitter.
Oh, yes.
So maybe,
I know. I
oh
follow
great.
Nibras. We'll drop it's Nibras.
Well,
Nibras.
I think she pronounces her
Nib-
name Nebras, but many of us
Nibras.
mispronounce her name.
Okay, we'll put Nebraska's Twitter handle in the show notes.
Right.
And then lastly, Anita, you do this work. This is your work now, or I think it's a part of your work now. We're going to link to that essay and to your blog and to your Twitter, obviously, but like just to share a little bit about how you work with people if they're hearing this and say, I want to go further.
Yeah, so I do a 90-minute somatic coaching session where essentially I ask the person to be laying down for the entirety of the session. So we'll start off with a nervous system exercise in the form of breathing. So we'll do a down-regulated breathing exercise to really calm the body and ground out the system. And then we'll get to the main part of the session, which is kind of feeds into the feeling your emotions layer of the pyramid, which is essentially dealing with unfelt emotions in the body, things that want to come up. And it's a very embodied experience and very focused on the body rather than maybe some problem that they're wanting to come to. Maybe like if they were going to therapy, they would come with a problem. But with this work, I just kind of ask, like, bring your body and let's see what your body wants to surface. And then we'll do a self-love guided meditation towards the end. And that's to essentially like familiarize the body with these sensations of love for oneself. And then we round it out with another nervous system exercise that I learned from Joe, which is a shaking off. So if there was any freezing in the system during the session, the shaking off helps brings the person out of that. And it's just a really nice way to round out the session.
Beautiful. And that people can learn about that on your website at
It's Info Distillery. Yeah, and
infodistillery.
Yeah,
And we'll put the link.
/coaching.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again, Anita. This was an absolute treat, and I can't wait for people to listen to